Nassim, thank you so much for joining us here at
Thank you.
Risk Minds.
I'm honored to be here. I don't know if you know, but the first time I lectured at Risk Minds was in 1998.
Wow, so this is
It
your
was
20th
20 years
anniversary.
ago. Either 1998, 99, I don't remember, but it's close enough, plus or minus 5%.
An awful lot has
20 years.
changed since then.
Not much. I mean, of course, this is much bigger, more sophisticated. The world did change a bit, but I'm honored to be here.
Good.
And I love coming back.
So 20 years after your first appearance here,
Yes.
what would you say are the greatest risks facing this industry now?
I mean, the fact is, we have two classes of problem. Let me talk about the more economic risk, and then I'll talk about the structural risk that we have. The economic risk is quite acute, that we have much more debt than we did 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, we had a crisis. So the same, it's like we cured the crisis, the debt crisis was debt. So we have accumulation of debt, and that's not very good. We also have an increase in moral hazard in the system. In other words, people gaming the system. More and more people are gaming the system. So we have to worry about it, but visibly many people are concerned, and this is why they go to risk conferences. That's the first one. The second one, something I addressed in Skin in the Game, is that people are still unable to realize that there should be no risk management. You should study risk taking, not risk management, because you cannot separate the income generating technique from the risks associated with it. They're not separable. It's the same, it's a decision making. And they all should be in a class of decision making on uncertainty. So you should attract more risk takers. And in fact, I see some risk takers, but I'm saying that you have to worry about an industry that's dominated by non-risk takers discussing risks and separating the function from that of risk taking.
Do you think that risk-taking would be facilitated more with the proliferation now of data and tech? Do you think that will help with that?
Not really. I think, and tomorrow I'll discuss it a little bit in my lecture, big data brings more risks than it solves. In principle, more data, the more knowledge we acquire, the more understanding we get. But in fact, with data comes a lot of noise. So people tend to drown in noise and have a lot of blind alleys, without knowing they're blind alleys. So there's a nice balance between technical knowledge and data, and that balance has been disrupted by too much data, but technical understanding has not grown. Tomorrow my lecture will be on how our grandmothers understand risks a lot better than so-called risk professionals.
And you don't think something like machine learning and AI will help with that and will catch up?
Machine learning will help you identify the profile of people capable of, cheating on their tax return or stuff like that. Machine learning cannot capture things in the class of risks I call fat tails. It will not, cannot. There's something like you cannot invent information.
So you're really valuing the human factor
some
and
classes
experience.
of human experience and human wisdom, and also tomorrow I'll talk about paranoia. That we have a natural tendency to be paranoid, and we shouldn't tamper with it. And a lot of psychologists of risks are tampering with it, not realizing that when you look at the problem and under richer assumptions from probability theory, in fact, your grandmother is correct and the psychologists of risk are wrong.
So if we are very risk averse now,
Yes,
is that what you're
yes.
saying? How do we counter that and mitigate that?
You should have a lot of paranoia about what I call ruin, and be more risk-taking in things that do not entail ruin. So the class of things that have ruin in them, worry. And in fact, a lot of people take ruin risks, but not regular risks, to try to avoid, to have a smooth income while taking a lot of tail risk, what I call tail risk, rather than just have more volatility of income but less tail risk.
So that's the key things you think are wrong. What would you say, where did you say the opportunities lie, and what are you optimistic about?
The optimistic. Every time you have a crisis, you have a chance for people who know how to play with crises to make some money, either with a crisis or coming out of the crisis. when other people are shell-shocked because they lost money in the crisis. So people have this notion that everybody should lose money at the same time. Well, it's not the case. There's a class of people. And you have to just learn how to handle a crisis ahead of time.
You talked about grandmothers getting it right. What do you mean by that, and where are they getting it right?
Let me give you a sobering statistic. More than 50% of psychology papers do not replicate. Okay? I'm sure that more than 99% of what your grandmother told you holds and will hold.
So we need to learn from experience and value
We
it.
learn from collective experience over time, dynamically, not from someone who just looked at a model, did some naive statistics and came up with a conclusion.
So just moving to a slightly different topic, with all of that in mind, we talked a bit about machine learning and AI earlier.
Yes.
How would you say global industrialization is changing the landscape? Because it's a slightly different industrialization to what it was in the mid-century, but what are we looking at now in terms of what that can do? Okay,
I've described the last crisis, after it happened, but also quite a bit before it happened, by explaining that the world has lost its island properties. So you had isolated islands, and when you have an island, you have a lot more biological diversity in an island than you do in a continent. And there's some people call it square law, because the larger the continent, the more species you're going to have, but the density will decrease. So since then, now the world is dominated by Facebook, by a few names, and so you see that for example, if you're a soccer player, a football player, 100 years ago, or 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you made a good income. It was more distributed. Today it's a winner-take-all effect. Now that winner-take-all effect we're observing because of globalization worldwide in economic life. It causes inequalities, but it also causes instability, because the road to the top, say the road to becoming Facebook or Google or Apple at a time, was short. The road back, to the college dorms, wherever they started, to the garage, is also equally short. So this tells us that you're going to have more and more concentration, more unfairness, but the system will calibrate itself by making the one at the top collapse so someone else can come to the top. If you tamper with it, you make people at the top become frozen in that position, and that's not good for the system long run. So you would like to see more diversity and more players out there? No, I would like to have more. I can understand the fight, the rise against globalism, because people want to have their own little industries, their own little industrial diversity preserved. And globalists sort of don't get it. They don't get that it's nice to have a global world, but with it comes concentration. So what do you want? Do you want concentration, or do you want, fairness? So they don't quite get it. But I think that with time, people are realizing that when you look at complexity models and apply them to the world, that some things taken for granted in economics, like economies of scale or globalization, they don't really hold. So what do you think now, just looking forward, will be the key themes that we'll be talking about, perhaps at this conference in a year's time? What do you see 2019 holding? I have no idea how to predict, but let me give you a rule. I call it the Lindy effect. Is the way I write my books is I make sure you can read them today, they're interesting today. But if I want people to interest people 10 years from now, I write something that would have been relevant today and 10 years ago. You see, this is how you don't just add things. So I think that we'll be talking next year about what we're talking about today, jointly today, and would have discussed 10 years ago. Or 20 years ago, given that I'm a veteran of this. So the same themes will be keeping people awake next year that have kept people awake for the last 20 years at night? Yeah, we'll be talking about the same thing with some variation, but your bet is I'm going to be talking about the same things. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. It's been great to talk to you. Thank you. Thanks.